Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, May 10th, 2021, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria, and I'm really excited about this week's episode, as always. But before we dive in, I do want to thank those of you who continue to make Talk Nerdy possible week after week after week after week after week. Remember, as I always say, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that's because I do rely on the support of listeners just like you. This week's top supporters include Mary Neva, Michael Gaucher, Brian Holden, Christopher Pitts, Daniel Lang, David J. E. Smith, Dudas Infinitus, June Sapara, Pasquale Gelati, Ulrika Hagman, Elise Christie, and Robert Christ. And if you want to hear your name at the top of the show, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. Okay, this week I had the opportunity to sit down with the co-author of the book Fire in Paradise, an American Tragedy. Now, this is some pretty heavy stuff. We're talking about the Paradise Fire, also known as the Camp Fire, that took place on November 8th, 2018, in which a community of 27,000 people were really, just surrounded by this devastating fire. It basically destroyed pretty much every house and killed at least 85 people. We're going to talk about how it happened, what some mitigation strategies in place could have done, which ones were in place and actually prevented more of a tragedy, and of course, what we can do in the future with increasing risk around wildfires. So I have on the show this week Dani Anguiano, and she writes for The Guardian. She was a reporter for the Chico Enterprise Record, and she lives up in the Pacific Northwest, but of course grew up quite close to Paradise. She did co-author the book with Alistair G., an editor and reporter at The Guardian, who also writes for several outlets. So without any further ado, everyone, here she is, Dani Anguiano. Well, Dani, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Cara. I'm so excited to be here.
I am too. I have to admit, when your book first came across my desk by your publisher, I immediately, reached out and said, I really, really, really want to talk about the Paradise Fire. I really want to talk about fires in general, the kind of fire season, what the sort of existential threat of fire is increasingly looking like here in California. And part of that is because, it's interesting to me, but part of that is because I am not a California native, but I'm a long-term transplant. So I probably moved here 13 years ago now. I'm in Southern California, so not near Paradise, but we have had our own kind of devastating fires down here in Southern California. But you yourself, actually, you grew up around Paradise?
Yeah, that's right. So I grew up in a little town called Chico, most famous for its university. And that's about 10 minutes down the road from Paradise. So I'm originally from Sacramento, but spent most of my life in Chico, graduated from high school there. And in fact, when I first moved to Chico, it was 2008. And my very first day there, the sky was this eerie red in a way that I had never seen before. And it was really smoky. And being new to the area, I didn't quite realize what was happening. And then I learned about these wildfires that the area was having. And at the time, they were really bad. People had to evacuate. Something like, I think, 50,000 acres burned in one of them. And that was kind of my welcome to Butte County in far northern California, just being greeted with smoke and flames and, seeing a lot of displaced people.
Right. Yeah. It's definitely growing up in Texas, I was exposed to a different kind of sort of existential natural disaster threat, which was tornadoes. And I was pretty exposed to hurricanes too, because they would happen in coastal cities and also in nearby states. Wildfires was always something I knew about in the back of my mind because you would see the Smokey the Bear commercials and you kind of, I don't know, like people who grow up in other parts of the country are like aware that, fire can happen out in nature. And you might be at a campsite and it's like, put out your campfire, or like, don't put cigarette butts out the window. But I don't think I ever really realized how flammable California really is.
Yeah, that's so true. California is a landscape that is really adapted to burn. Fire is one of those things, I think, where with hurricanes and tornadoes, we understand to some extent that we can't really prevent those things, right? Those things are going to happen. How do you stop a hurricane or a tornado? But with fire, because there is some element of human control, we see a fire and we can extinguish it. We sort of felt like we've had dominion over fire, that we can stop it. And that's kind of what, as a state and as a country, we did. We put out fires for the last 100 years or so. And what actually happens is when you take a place like California and the West more broadly that is adapted for wildfire that needs flames, it's a positive thing in the landscape. And when you take that out, what happens is the forests grow really dense and thick. And when you do have fires, they will be a lot worse than the fires you would have had otherwise.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you mentioned just this idea of sort of humanity feeling like we have dominion over fire. And I mean, I bring this up because just this weekend, so I live in Eagle Rock, California, which is a town. I mean, it is Los Angeles. It's a neighborhood in eastern northern Los Angeles near Pasadena, and just this weekend, basically the vacant house right on my block, like a couple doors down, went up in flames. I was playing board games with some friends and we went outside to watch the spectacle. I mean, there was probably 50 fire trucks, like 6 ladder trucks. The whole street was shut down. Hundreds of pedestrians were standing around watching this building in flames and watching these incredible firefighters put it out incredibly quickly. And of course, it was very dangerous. And of course, there was black smoke in the air. But I think we're used to, when we think of fire, we think of structure fires like that, where there are all these barriers and boundaries and sort of human made structures are burning. But when it comes to natural or not so natural fire within a natural landscape, it's not so easy. And I'm not saying it's easy to put out a structure fire either, but it's definitely not so easy to contain, is it?
No, no, not at all. I think that's so true. When we think of fire, there's someone we can call, right? We call 911, people show up and they respond to these structure fires, as you mentioned. But when you look at the landscape, we're talking about tens of millions of acres. And again, this is landscape that wants to burn, that's ready to burn, right? And the question really becomes is, okay, well, we've been asking ourselves, how do we stop that for the last 100 years? And then now we're asking, oh no, we don't want to stop that. How do we let that happen safely? While also keeping in mind, these towns and cities within forests or around forests that are at risk when the forest burns.
Yeah, I think living in LA and being, somewhat dialed into kind of conservation efforts or at least science communication here in LA, I've definitely come to understand this idea of these kind of like prescribed burns or these prescripted burns where it's intentional, where sometimes they're actually laid, where there's a burn line, where we know that certain areas of forest that have become too dense or that are overdue for burn are burned in a sort of natural way, or if they do catch on fire, that it's kind of I don't know, there's a calculus there. And I guess that's probably not something that people who live outside of these types of areas are probably familiar with.
No, no, it's not. Fire, I think it's one of those things. It's such a primal reaction that we have, right? When we see fire, to be so afraid and want to get away. And so a lot of people, aren't familiar with the concept of prescribed burning, or it's just really frightening to think, right? Because fire is something that we kind of have this precarious control over to some extent. So it can be really scary for people to see fire being used in their communities. But I think increasingly what we're seeing is people getting a better sense of what this is and how important it is. I mean, compared to when I moved to far northern California, 13 or 14 years ago to now, back then there, at least in my memory, there weren't the same conversations about prescribed fire. Now it's something that people understand that, okay, we actually need fire if we want to avoid bad fires.
Absolutely. And, working as a reporter for like writing for The Guardian, living in San Francisco, I'm wondering, obviously, you spoke to the fact that Chico was your hometown for so long and that's right next to Paradise. Was that really the core motivation for you to start writing this book with your co-author, Alistair G, or was this built off of investigations that you were doing, reporting that you were doing, boots on the ground?
A little bit of both, I would
Okay.
say. So I moved from Butte County to the Bay Area in July or August of 2018. That's about 3 months before the campfire happened. And the way it happened is one day I was at work and I started getting texts from family members who lived in Paradise telling me what was going on and saying, please pray for our home. Um, and when that happened, knowing what I knew about Paradise, so to tell you a little bit about Paradise, it was this town of on 27,000 or so people nestled in the Sierra Nevada foothills, really just beneath the trees, really naturally beautiful, and just this classic small American town. One high school, I think they got their first stoplight in the 60s. And so, yeah, a really, really charming place. And basically what happened was that morning a fire started in a nearby canyon. It was really dry and spectacularly windy, and so when this fire started, the wind just accelerated it and the flames raced through some small settlements in the foothills, and pretty quickly, moving faster than scientists knew that fire could move, it got to Paradise, swept over this town, and forced tens of thousands of people to have to run for their lives all at the same time.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it was really shocking, like defied the imagination. And so when that happened, I was, as I said, with the Guardian in our office in Oakland. Within a couple hours, I could smell the smoke from
Oh,
Paradise.
wow.
Yeah, it was such a large amount of acreage that burned. And so pretty quickly, I told my office, you need to send me to cover this. This is going to be really bad. Um, and so I spent, a couple weeks on the ground covering this fire, going into Paradise as it was burning and telling these stories. And what led me ultimately to write this book was, I would say, a combination of realizing that this story has such huge implications for the state and the country as a whole and how we're going to live through the climate crisis. And then also, really being motivated by the fact that this is an area that I consider home, that I love, and I really wanted to make sure that our story was told, and especially by someone who knows it.
Absolutely. I'm I saw a couple of documentaries about the fire in Paradise, and for those maybe international listeners, or maybe some who just like weren't paying much attention, this you'll hear us calling it the fire in Paradise. Paradise, the name of the town, or the campfire, not like a campfire. I think that's like such a weird misnomer, but like it can't.
Yes.
It was called the camp fire because fires get named. And why was it named the campfire? Did it start in a town or an area called Camp?
Right. So it started off, the nearest road was Camp Creek Road. And so that's how it got
Gotcha.
that kind of unfortunate name that makes
Yeah.
people scratch their heads.
Yeah. So those are obviously interchangeable terms because we're referring to the same big burn event. But if you haven't seen, there's a couple of great documentaries. I think there's one on PBS that I watched, one on Netflix, that show some of this very POV footage. I mean, they're devastating and horrifying, and we'll be getting into some of that. But it really does capture the fear of the individuals who were basically unwittingly trapped, who needed to try to get out as quickly as possible. And unfortunately, some of the people who were not able to get out. And so this is one of those fascinating and dire stories, right, Dani, where we know that some of this was Mother Nature at her fiercest, and some of this was, failures in public planning, and some of this was failures in social justice, and just a lot of difficult things all came together for this tragedy to actually occur.
Right. Yeah. It was really this combination of a couple different big problems. One, you have California getting hotter and drier, these conditions exacerbated by the climate crisis, creating or basically leading to fires that burn more intensely. So you have that. You have a town that was in a very kind of precarious spot in the wilderness, where this town knew that it would burn one day. The entire town knew that. They knew that they were at risk of a really bad fire. Living in that area, especially in Paradise, people were used to fire. They were used to smelling smoke in the fall, to occasionally evacuating. And it was a town that was actually pretty prepared for that, that had practiced evacuations, that had things broken down into evacuation zones and this evacuation alert system. So you have that, like the precariousness of where it is, the fact that more people were moving into this foresty area because it was cheaper than living in the valley, all those things. And then you have where the fire started. The fire was actually started by um, basically a piece of equipment that malfunctioned on an electricity transmission line owned by PG&E. It was almost 100 years old, this tower and this piece of equipment, when it failed, um, and caused this fire that, as we said, essentially wiped out the town of Paradise, devastated some other communities nearby, and then killed 85 people.
And this is not the first time, and it's not the and it was not a new development, or people were aware that there were these failing electrical, I guess, towers or whatever they were that PG&E owned. I mean, this resulted in a very large lawsuit. This resulted in some massive inquiries. Like, this is actually not an uncommon source of forest fire, isn't it?
No, not at all. In fact, human caused fires are, I think, the only fire ignition source that's gone up or so in the last 30 years. And generally, what that's been is you have fires started by power lines, whether it is a tree falling onto a power line and starting a fire, or in this case, a piece of equipment that was badly in need of replacement for a long time, failing and starting a fire. So PG&E has really, in the last probably 4 or so years, has really been more associated with these fires and causing these fires. And even before that, PG&E itself kind of has a troubled history. If you've seen Aaron Brockovich,
Mhm.
yeah, right, and learned about some of the issues with the water supply in that town being poisoned, and then more recently, there was a gas pipeline explosion that killed several people in the Bay Area. And so I think in the last few years, PG&E's name has really, for many Californians, come to be associated with disaster and mismanagement and ultimately greed.
Yeah. Oh, and it's so we've got these multiple layers that I think I do want to dig into, and maybe I'm not really even sure how to start going about organizing them, but probably the big one that you touched on for a second has to do with global climate change. It has to do with human interference in the actual temperature of the air, of the land, the actual amount of water that's available to keep the land moist, the amount of infrastructure, non-permeable infrastructure that has been built all over the country that actually, reduces the ability for the water cycle to flow the way it, naturally did for millions and millions of years. Like, talk to me a little bit about the sort of big picture about how are wildfires linked to climate change?
Right. So there's a couple of factors here. Like we've said, we have both the fact that this landscape needs fire. It needs fires to keep our forests healthy and not overly dense. That's certainly part of it. But the other part of it is with the effects of the climate emergency, California has become hotter. It's become drier. We've had this devastating drought that killed, tens of millions of trees. And when the landscape gets hotter and drier, those things burn more readily and more intensely. And so, even though, for instance, in this fire, again, started by a failing PG&E transmission line, started by that. However, when I talked to people, when I interviewed people in Paradise, a lot of people were thinking, the conditions in the area weren't what they should be for early November. People were wearing shorts. It was hot and dry and extremely windy. And so when you have these conditions all come together, they're conditions that lend themselves to really severe, intense fires. That if California, if it wasn't as hot, if it wasn't as dry, it's hard to say whether we would have seen that same fire. I'm thinking it's probably not.
Right. Yeah. And you actually get that feeling living here. It's like a day by day feeling as you're entering into the summer and then the later summer and fall months and even into, like you said, early winter. I guess technically November is supposed to be winter. You do have that sensibility when you're driving around town, when you're out and about and you're like, oh gosh, it's hot. It's windy today. I really hope there's not a fire. You can almost feel the risk factor going up. It's a sensibility in the air.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. One of the main residents we talk about in our book, his name was John Sedgwick, a volunteer firefighter in his 80s. He would sit down every day for dinner and pray, "Please, Jesus, no fires today." He was so connected to the landscape and to that area, and knew how at risk it was. That was just something, this ever present fear in his mind.
Absolutely. And so you've got this, you know, I guess natural in the sense that, yes, nature is going to do what nature is going to do, but of course, exacerbated by human intervention and by all of the factors that we know contribute to climate change. You've got this sort of readiness of the land. And then you add to it now these other layers. So the first factor being, this old electrical equipment that's failing that we know has a tendency to down or to spark or to ignite in areas that are really hard to reach, right? Like difficult serviceable areas. I feel like I've heard this story time and time again that there's a transformer or there's a power line and it's like up on a hill in the middle of nowhere
Yeah.
and you can't really access it. I mean, wasn't that similar in this situation?
That was exactly the case in this situation. It was a very remote tower, very difficult terrain, so that when the fire started, firefighters knew about it pretty quickly, almost right away. The issue was is that the wind was whipping the flames so quickly and their access point to the tower was so limited that there was no way for them to get down there in time without the risk just being so great. I mean, literally the road that they would have had to go down to get to this tower, the mirrors on the fire engine would have been like hitting the side of the canyon. It's really, really difficult to access terrain.
Right. And you need these big fire trucks. These ladder trucks are so important to be able to get to where they need to go, to be able to have the hoses available or, to be able to fight the flames. One thing that I remember, this is sort of an aside because I'm sure we'll be getting there. I'm trying to maintain some sort of order in my own mind. Is I remember in one of the documentaries, somebody saying that, they were basically their car was about to be engulfed in flames and there's black smoke everywhere. They were trying to escape and they were like bumper to bumper. And I guess a fire engine or something was barreling down the road, an emergency vehicle, and they were able to get into it. But they were like, it's so funny because you think in your mind, oh, it's a fire truck. It must be fireproof. And it's like, no, it's not.
No, no,
Fire
it's
trucks
not.
aren't built to be fireproof. They're built to get the people to where they need to go so the people can then use the tools available to them to fight
Exactly.
fire.
That's exactly right. And yeah, I'm sure we'll get to it, but that's the thing is you had firefighters in that exact same situation in their trucks thinking, oh no, I don't think we're going to make it out of this. Because yeah, those trucks aren't fireproof. They're just there to help them fight the flames.
Yeah, they're just trucks. And I mean, I think
Right.
that's the thing that we don't realize when we think about, I don't know why. It's one of those things that we put on a shelf. Like, oh, these are heroes and they work really hard and they have all these great tools and they'll figure it out. And we never really stop to parse that in our minds. Like, no, they're not driving asbestos trucks. They're driving
No,
red trucks. They're just painted red. That's
exactly.
the
That's
difference.
exactly right.
Oh gosh. And so okay, we've got this landscape that's begging for it. We add to that this failing power equipment that hasn't been maintained that's in a really remote area in a canyon drive that's very difficult to get to. And then what are some other failures? Because I know that kind of in the aftermath, we've learned more and more in doing the research that even though Paradise, for example, had a wonderful evacuation plan in place, this specific fire made that evacuation plan ultimately, not at the beginning, but ultimately in the grand scheme of things, partially moot. Like, what was so
Right.
special about this situation?
Well, a couple things, and I'll rewind a little bit by talking about the tower where the fire started,
Oh,
because
great. Yeah.
one of the things that people One of the misconceptions I hear, for instance, is that so going into that week, November 2018, the fire risk was high. California was had red flag conditions, dry, windy, and PG&E has started this program, right? That when things are like that, when conditions are particularly dangerous, they will just shut the power grid down in some areas to avoid starting fires. Um, so yeah, and so we've seen that the last couple of years where you have millions of people going without power for days at a time. And that's what Paradise expected to happen. They knew conditions were going to be bad. They had been warned the power will probably be shut off. Now, that didn't happen, but even if it had, it wouldn't have stopped the fire from starting because they shut out, lines in town, distribution lines. But the line where this fire started is a transmission line. It's the kind of line that sends power to whole regions. It's basically too big for them to shut off. So even if they had turned the power off that day, that line would have continued on. So what happens is yes, this fire starts and it's pretty quickly out of control. Firefighters can see that this is going to be a bad one, and they're trying to get as many engines on it as possible. Pretty quickly, it meets this area called Concow that is quite rural. It's this rural, isolated settlement. That's where it lands first. That's where people basically look outside and see their backyards on fire or their homes on fire and have to start leaving. And from there, the fire is just racing toward Paradise. And it gets there so quickly that people start calling 911 and saying, hey, there's a fire here. And the dispatchers, working with the best information they have, are saying, no, that's a fire, a couple miles away in Concow. There's no fire in Paradise. And people are saying, no, I can see this fire in my backyard. So from there, that's basically what is telling a lot of people to leave is the sight of flames themselves. Because though, as I mentioned, Paradise had this system. They had an evacuation warning system. They had planned for this. They had zones. The problem is that their warning system was an opt-in system, so you had to have signed up for it. Right, and that typically that's automatically going to mean fewer people are going to get those warnings. And from there, the fire was taking out cell phone towers left and right. So a lot of the warnings just weren't getting to people. But people saw the flames. They heard from neighbors. They got woken up by the police. And what happened is, as I said, 27,000 people essentially all got on the roads at the same time. And even in the best case scenario, right? Even in a city that has plenty of roads, which that wasn't the case with Paradise. Paradise had about 3 main routes off that mountain and into the valley. And when you have 27,000 people all getting on the roads at the same time, no matter how well you have planned, you're going to encounter gridlock. And that's what happened. People encountered gridlock, and then the flames are basically on top of them. And so it just happened so quickly that the experts we talked to have said that, Paradise is actually, I think, was a lot better prepared than people gave it credit for. But there's almost no way to prepare to get that many people out. The thing that you need to do is start finding ways to shelter people safely in the city, because that many people getting them out all at once on that many roads, it's basically impossible.
I see. So having I don't know, fireproof bunkers, fireproof regions where you can house a lot of people at once in case if they can't get out is another step towards kind of mitigating disaster.
And that's something they did. They had areas where people went to, like, big parking lots, basically big asphalt parking lots. There were quite a few people who just rode things out in there until they could leave.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I know that I remember hearing a lot of the rhetoric, or at least the things that individuals were saying, because it was their personal experience that they were like, we are surrounded. And I'm wondering, did that pan out when forensically the fire was starting to be understood in the aftermath? Was it really kind of coming into the town from multiple sides? Because we often think of fire as coming down one path, and so you can sort of just outrun it. But people were saying literally it feels like we're being surrounded by fire.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened. So with this fire, it's just like you said, we think of it as coming at us from one angle, right? Sort of a wall of
Mhm.
flames coming at us from one direction. And in fact, that's what the city had prepared for, from fire coming from the east or fire coming from the west. But what actually happened was this fire was so big and, essentially creating its own weather, that it was spitting out these things called firebrands. Basically, a burning piece of vegetation, a leaf, a branch of this or that. It was spitting those out sometimes as much as a mile ahead of the actual main body of the fire. And so then you had fires starting all over town. One of the officers who we spoke with the police department, his first call that day, he was responding to a fire in the middle of the neighborhood. And basically, it was this giant, massive ponderosa pine tree that was on fire, and nothing else in the neighborhood was on fire. And it was one of those things caused by a firebrand. And so from there, once these fires started, then you really did have flames from all directions just coming onto the town.
Yeah. Oh gosh, it's it's easy to in some ways and so hard to in other ways empathize with the fear that the individual residents must have had as they were kind of facing this so quickly without much warning and in a way that probably felt quite paralyzing. I'm wondering, in once the dust had settled, do we know how many people or at least what percentage of the city actually was able to evacuate?
So we don't have firm numbers on that, but I would say the vast majority of the city was able to leave. There were a handful of people who wrote it out, but I mean, literally a handful of people, because just the entire town was overrun. You had people who got out with first responders who hopped on fire trucks, people who were trying to walk out and hitchhiked, who just got into whoever's car they could get into. And ultimately, yeah, what we found is that with about 27,000 people in Paradise, a few more thousand people in the nearest town, Magalia up north, all in all, 85 people died, which it's a staggering, horrible number. But when you look at the demographics of the town, this was a town with a larger share of older residents, retired seniors, a population that was more disabled than the rest of the state. When keeping all those things in mind, in some ways, it's one of the things that town leadership told me and told Alistair, my co-author, was that in some ways it's incredible that there weren't more deaths, as terrible as that sounds.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I do think we focus and we remember the tragic stories of the people, the bodies found burned in cars, or the individuals who, like you mentioned, decided I'm just going to stay home or for whatever reason, I shouldn't say decided, but, for whatever reason, stayed home and couldn't get out. And those are like just horrifying stories. But you're right. There are so many people who were able to escape, or at least, I guess, able to weather the the flames and came out alive, which, I think we're all very grateful for.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this fire was just so shocking, and the intensity and how fast it was, that, as I mentioned, there were some people who did decide to stay, who decided either they were going to wait it out because, as I said, this is an area prone to fire. They were used to fire. They thought they understood how it behaved. And the man I mentioned, John, the retired firefighter, he decided to stay because he wanted to be of help to his neighbors and to firefighters from out of town. And that's what he did. He helped neighbors save their homes. He helped save this 100-year-old firehouse where he used to work. And he helped the out of town firefighters who had come from the Bay Area and Southern California, who didn't know that area. He gave them information about where the flames were and that sort of thing. So he decided ultimately to stay and try to put his skills to use there. It just turned out that this fire was so beyond the scope of anything he had seen.
And ultimately, did firefighters, I mean, I'm sure they made an impact, but ultimately, was the role of firefighters in the grand scheme of things really just to save lives? Because at a certain point, it feels like it was a losing battle to try and actually fight the blaze.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Pretty early on, when the flames got to Paradise, it very quickly became a life-saving operation of just get people out. So you had firefighters going into neighborhoods and telling people to leave, trying to stop flames where they could. But ultimately, their focus had to be on just saving lives and getting people out of there.
Yeah, yeah. I'm interested, we had kind of been speaking a little bit offline about some of your interest areas and the places where you've put in a lot of effort in your reporting. Some of the kind of more social justice issues and the issues around equity and housing, fair housing, things of that nature. And I'm wondering how some of these, we talked first about the climate change impact, the natural kind of course of fire and the way that fire wants to burn. We talked about PG&E and some of the issues that were mitigated there. The fire plans that were in place that were wonderful and actually like really did prepare the town, but ultimately were just overwhelmed by the intensity of this fire. What were some of the other sort of factors about this specific town that we now know probably contributed?
Right. So Paradise, even before I started on this book, growing up in Chico, I knew that Paradise was this really beautiful place, and it was a place that was more affordable than the Valley. It was a place where seniors could go to retire, and they knew that their money would go further there. Where families knew that they would have a little more space, for their kids to run around. It was really this kind of affordable haven in a state that, I'm sure, as you know, is just gets more expensive every single year. Um, but what happened with that is that the way the town developed over the last, 50 or so years was very kind of haphazard. Um, the town didn't have, for instance, a sewage system. Everyone was on septic tanks. Um, and because it had only become a town, relatively recently in its history, there were just certain rules about development and that sort of thing that didn't exist there that say existed in the cities that might have protected them, um, and things like that. So that certainly played a role. And then what happened is when this fire came through, it hit this town, and by extension, it hit the people who were, most vulnerable and already most at risk and struggling. Um, you know, I would say that the lack of affordable housing in California, and particularly in the Valley, really pushes people further and further out into these areas that we consider more at risk for fire. Um, yeah, and then what happens is these people are made homeless and are made to try to rebuild their lives when they were already struggling before the fire had even happened.
Oh, and so you've just got this kind of negative feedback loop that occurs. I mean, I think probably it's important to transition, and I'm not sure. And you just stop me if you feel like there's more that you want to cover before we transition into sort of what went wrong to what can we now do? Because I think the main and most important takeaway here is that this is going to happen again. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when and what can we do to really get out in front of this.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, just last fall, I was back in Butte County reporting on another devastating fire. Yeah, last year, I'm sure as you know, was California's worst fire season in terms of acres burned. And another few dozen people died, including 16 people just down the road from Paradise in Berry Creek, another kind of remote mountain settlement, and another 16 people died there. And so I was back there this past fall covering the fire there, and I couldn't believe it. Like, even having written this book, having the conversations that I do with climate scientists and fire experts, and knowing that this is going to happen again and again and again, I still was shocked to be back reporting on another deadly fire, in my home county, not even 2 years later.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're right. I'm just thinking about all of the places, even in Southern California, that just got hit so incredibly hard. And Northern California, it was that much worse. I mean, watching the news just last year, the year before, it was devastating. It was absolutely devastating. And I think most of us who live in California cities and even Oregon and Washington, for that matter, definitely Oregon, they know what it's like to drive through smoke, or they know what it's like to have to sweep ash off of their cars or off of their patios. Even living here in LA, this like urban center, there have been several times where there's ash all over the ground when you go outside in the morning, and you feel the effects of a fire, whether it's next door or far away, being carried by our weather. It's a daily part of life.
Yeah, exactly. It's, I think, something we all are just becoming kind of increasingly used to, that each year, yeah, we'll see ash floating through the air, limiting our time outside because it's hard to breathe. And that's one of the things about these fires, is that even if you're not living, in a landscape that's more likely to burn, right? Even if you're living in an urban city like Los Angeles or San Francisco, you're not immune from the effects of these wildfires. I talked to someone at Stanford a couple months ago who was doing research into how many premature deaths we saw that were associated with this wildfire smoke. And all in all, it's a couple thousand across the West Coast of people who probably wouldn't have died were it not for the exposure of smoke, even hundreds of miles away from these fires.
So it makes me wonder then, in all of the research that you've done, all of the reporting that you've done, and kind of interviewing these climate scientists and these city organizers and planners and these firefighters, what do we do about that? Like, how could a Paradise have been better prepared? Like, what lessons can we learn from Paradise to prevent another one?
Right. And that's something I think every town in the foothills across California is asking themselves, is, okay, how do we stop this from happening again? And there's a couple different elements there. One is our utilities, having our a utility like PG&E address its infrastructure. The fact that the tower that started this fire, that it was almost 100 years old, that it was, older than many of the residents who had lived in the area for decades. Our utilities shouldn't be causing fires that kill people. It's kind of a part of life now. It's a thing that happens every year. But I think that is so key. PG&E needs to make a massive investment in its infrastructure, and it's pretty difficult. They have thousands and thousands and thousands of miles of lines. But I think where the criticism comes in is that PG&E, people look at PG&E and say, well, okay, you're giving your shareholders this much profit every year. You're spending money. A judge said, like, hey, you're spending money that could have been spent on improvements and just taking it as a profit. That's part of it, certainly. The other part of it is addressing the climate crisis. I mean, that is what it comes down to, I think, for so many things, is, we just have to reduce our emissions, and reduce the impact we're having on the planet. And that's something we could do. These are all things we can do. It's interesting when I talk to fire scientists. I'm always struck by like how they kind of straddle this line of being always warning, like, hey, this year is going to be really bad, but also still expressing optimism.
Hmm.
It's pretty impressive seeing how bad the last 2 years have been and how bad the next few years are forecast to be. The fact that they are still very hopeful, and what makes them hopeful is that we're having more conversations about prescribed burns, and not trying to remove fire from the landscape, but seeing how we can use it, how we can partner with local tribes and the indigenous people that have been doing this for thousands of years to try to protect this landscape. And then also the other thing that comes into it that I think people don't always think about is there are things that homeowners can do to protect their homes from fire. So what we saw in Paradise, for instance, was that a lot of those homes were older. And when, some initial research showed basically that homes that were built more recently in the last 10 or so years, say, that those homes had a much better chance of surviving. So there are things you can do around your house, like, for instance, not having a bunch of stuff piled up around your house that can catch on fire. Ensuring that your vents around your attic are secure, because that's how a little burning piece of brush slips in and catches your house on fire. Certain things around less flammable siding, clearing out your trees. These things actually make a difference. They really do. And so it's not all doom and gloom. We can teach people how to live in these areas safely. And that's something that I I don't know, maybe it's because I'm from this area, but it's something that's so important to me. I remember after this fire, there were, so many opinion pieces from far away newspapers saying things like Paradise shouldn't be rebuilt.
Oh,
And that
wow.
frankly,
What?
oh yeah, it really it really bothers me. And it really bothers the people in this area to have, people thousands of miles away telling them what they should do with their town. And yes, you're certainly at risk when we're living in an area that's more prone to fire. But ultimately, people are going to live in these areas. And, historically, they've lived there because it's what they can afford. And I tend to lean that, we should teach people how to live there safely. There are certain tax breaks the government, the state could put in place to try to encourage people to make sure their homes are safer in wildfires. And those things really, they do help. They really do make a difference.
Yeah, and you know what? The truth of the matter is, I guess I get pissed off when I hear about these op-eds because I used to get this a lot growing up in Texas and then moving to LA, and people are like, "Oh God, first you go from tornadoes and then you go to earthquakes or wildfires. Like how like why do you want to live in a place that's trying to kill you?" And it's like we have damaged the planet so much that there's nowhere that's not like that. And like natural disasters are a part of life for the vast majority of individuals on this planet. And it's just that
Hmm.
gross blaming the victim kind of mentality of like, well, if you
Hmm.
don't want to burn to death in a fire, move someplace where there's no fires. And it's like, so you want me to move to a place where there's hurricanes then? I don't understand. Like
Exactly.
it's
It's
infuriating.
infuriating. Yeah.
Uh, and I think especially the affordable housing component of that argument is such an important one. People are going to live where they can afford to live, and so it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we are, voting the appropriate way, that we are voting with our dollars, and that we are ensuring that we put, our tax dollars at work to help support these communities and ensure that whatever mitigation efforts are in place can be in place. And like you said, we've got to start with the corporations who actually ultimately, I mean, they were found to be, and I'm not saying this like this isn't an op-ed here, like PG&E was
Hmm.
found to be at fault, like legally
Yes.
was found to be at
They
fault.
they pled guilty to 84 counts of manslaughter.
There you go. And so I think we saw this recapitulated just this last winter in Texas when they refused to winterize their grid or to expand it in such a way that allowed for stopgaps and safety. And we saw people losing their lives there. This is something that is not an uncommon theme. And so obviously change can be affected there. As you said, being really focused on climate change and mitigation efforts. And yes, there are things that we can do as individuals. We can make sure that we keep our buildings up to code. If we're homeowners, if we're renters, we can make sure that, like you said, we can keep clutter, big flammable furniture pieces outside of like the burn lines in front of our homes. And I even remember in a home, I think it was the last place I lived when we were doing some landscape planning, talking to the landscapers about putting in drought resistant and burn resistant plants. Like actually planting native gardens oftentimes is a
Yes.
really good mitigation effort.
Exactly. Yeah, that's one of the things that comes up again and again when we look at like how can we protect our homes. That's so important and a lot of people don't know about that.
Yeah, and native plants are usually cheaper and easier because you don't have to bring them in from, out of state or out of the city. Like native plants naturally grow there. They require less water. They require less focus, less, fidgeting. Like you don't have to have as green a thumb to keep a native garden healthy. And they evolved in place, which means that they probably have some evolutionary protections against the natural landscape, which, in California is drought and it's fire.
That's exactly right.
Oh, so there's so much. There's so much that we can do, that we can be empowered to do, that we can make sure that our representatives do. But also, like you said, just being kind of vigilant, knowing that this is going to happen again and knowing, how to be prepared if you live in a fire zone, or for that matter, if you live in an earthquake zone, a tornado zone, a hurricane zone. I'm probably leaving out a volcano zone, different natural disasters, making sure that your family has a plan in place, a go bag, food stocked up, clean water, all of the things that are, recommended to be able to ensure your own safety is probably equally as important, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. That's the first thing that officials recommend during fire season is having a plan, have gas in your car, have your medications packed, so that when it comes down to it, you're not scrambling at the last minute to try to get things together. And they say that every year. Every year, I see the local sheriff's department send out that notice to people. Um, and the thing is that, like you said, there's so many things we can do. There are things that we can do. And so the reason that I get so frustrated about, this sort of attitude, kind of blaming the victim about, well, they shouldn't be living there or we shouldn't rebuild, is it that attitude really kind of takes away our own agency to actually do things and create change and make a safer world, and to hold corporations and our government accountable for that.
Yeah, it's almost like they win. Like it's a learned helplessness thing. And I think we see that
Exactly.
too with climate change as well, is that so many people feel so overwhelmed by the massive scale of the problem that we're like, I mean, yeah, okay, I recycle and I use reusable straws or whatever, but like that's not really going to make a difference. It's like, A, it does make a difference, but B, you're right. Like we have to hold these large government and corporate kind of entities feet to the flame. I mean, no pun intended. And we have to make sure that they're held responsible because they have a lot of power in this and they can actually affect change on a literally on a global scale, or at least on a municipal scale. So Dani, I'm wondering, I mean, obviously there's so much more to say. Of course, the whole point here, I hope, is that people will pick up the book, Fire in Paradise, An American Tragedy, so that they can learn more about what went wrong, what can go right, and actually hear some of these very human stories that are, really inspirational and I think heartwarming, truly. But I'm wondering, before we move on to the closing kind of section of these episodes, is there anything that you feel like we didn't touch on that you want to make sure gets talked about?
Right. Kind of twofold. I think the thing about this book is it's a devastating, it's a really sad story about what happened to this town. But as you mentioned, it's also, I think, really inspiring because you read about the goodness of people and the resilience of people. People like the former volunteer firefighter who I mentioned earlier, John Sedgwick, who told his daughter to evacuate and decided to stay and help his community and help his neighbors. I think so often we have this idea that in disasters, it's every person for themselves and it's chaos. But actually, what I found from talking to people was really incredible, of people coming together and helping each other. One woman I talked to was only able to evacuate because someone stopped for her and said, you can't get out on foot, you should get in my car. There's so many stories like that of people coming together and helping to save each other's lives. And I think that's for me just such an important part of the book, to see that, and to also see the resilience of people, to see their determination to rebuild, and to bring their community back. And the other thing, the reason why I think it's so relevant is not just because California will continue to burn, but also because this disaster is still unfolding. It's by no means over. For many thousands of people, this is still a disaster, even though it happened, about 2.5 years ago now. You have hundreds of people still living in FEMA housing, thousands of people who are still trying to rebuild their lives. And so I think, going forward, approaching this monumental disaster, we have to realize that it goes beyond just the couple days that it's on the news, that this changes people's lives and affects them for years and years, and affects cities for years and years. The city I grew up in, Chico, is a very different place. Overnight it grew by 10,000 people, basically. I think it's up to 16,000 people now. And it's a very, very different place than it was, when I was growing up. That county is really being shaped by disaster. So that's the other thing that I think we should all keep in mind, is just that this isn't over. It's still ongoing for people.
Right. I feel like if you don't think that geopolitical conflict and increase in kind of refugee status around the world is not directly linked to climate change, then your eyes haven't been opened. Like, we are going to be seeing more and more interpersonal and geopolitical conflict directly as a result of natural disasters, because we know that there's a high level of correlation between, the disasters that occur from climate change and displacement of peoples. And this is a perfect example of that happening sort of for those of us who live on the west coast of the United States, right in our backyard. So I think that's such an important point to make. So Dani, I'm wondering, I always close my episodes by asking my guests the same two questions. And I'm always interested in where they kind of come from when they approach these questions, because my guests come from all different walks of life. So they're big picture questions, but I want you to look at them in whatever context you feel is relevant to you. So it could be, your work, it could be something new that you've been reporting on. It could also be personal or just, local, global, cosmic, whatever is relevant to you. The first question is, when you look at the future, and you really start to ponder it and think about, number one, what is the thing that really is keeping you up the most at night? The thing you're most concerned about, maybe even a little bit cynical about, really just not looking forward to. And then on the flip side of that, what are you actually kind of authentically hopeful for? What are you truly optimistic about, sort of as the other side of that coin?
Right. I would say the thing that keeps me up at night is just, I mean, just on a very human level, the future of Butte County and the area that I consider my home. Right now, I'm living in Portland, Oregon, and my plan has always been to move back home, to move back to Northern California, where most of my family has lived for basically the last 70 years. And I worry about the future of that land. We're seeing days there. We're seeing more days over 100 degrees. We're already a very hot area, but every year we see more and more days over 100 degrees. And I wonder if it's possible. I wonder what life will look like there in the next 40 years. Is it going to be the sort of place that's too hard to live in, where people can't even go outside? That's something that really keeps me up at night, actually, is wondering, like, will I be able to move home and have kids there and that sort of thing. It genuinely gives me nightmares, actually. But on the same token, I always feel that way when I'm far away, when I'm not at home. But when I go home, and I was back in Chico and Paradise just last month, that's when I feel most hopeful, actually, is talking to people who live in Paradise, people who are rebuilding in Paradise. Their determination and I don't know, sort of clear-eyed vision for their future. They know that this area is at risk. They know it's going to keep facing natural disasters over and over again. But they also know that they can manage it. They can live there safely. That hope that they have really buoys me, I would say. And also remembering sort of the optimism that I get from fire scientists, which is that, like, we can live with fire. We can figure it out. Even though it's devastating right now and we're seeing disaster after disaster and it's scary, there are signs of hope that we can figure out how to live with fire, and we're going to have to. So it's kind of two in the same, of one being scared for that future, but also feeling some signs of hope.
Yeah, and I think that the truth of the matter is that we in many respects know what to do. We have good evidence-based approaches, and like you said, we've also been opening our eyes and our ears even more to kind of indigenous approaches to fire maintenance and maintenance of our forests. And we have good ideas, and the question is, do we have the political will to follow through with them? I mean, I think we're in a much more hopeful place now than we were in the past, when we had a president saying we just need to rake the forest, and then we won't have nearly as many fires. Like, what is that? But the truth of the matter is, we do have evidence-based approaches. And if we can listen to these experts and we can integrate these into public policy more and more often, I do think that there is good hope for the future. Like, science may not save us, but science is a good guiding light for us. And I think being able to learn from those who have gone before and who have developed really good strategies is never a bad idea. So Dani, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time with us today. Everyone, the book is Fire in Paradise, an American Tragedy. Dani, thank you so much. It was really enlightening.
Thank you, Cara. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.